What if the hospitals we believed were built to heal were never truly meant to cure? What if behind their towering red brick walls, the quiet of medicine concealed something far darker? Imagine rooms not filled with recovery, but with neglect, with cruelty, with secrets whispered too low to be recorded. For more than a century, America's state hospitals stood like solemn monuments to progress. Politicians praised them as sanctuaries. Families entrusted their loved ones, convinced that within those walls, they would find protection, education, and care. But history, if we dare to look closely, tells us another story. Inside, patients lay tied to their beds, starved, forgotten, abandoned in overcrowded wards. Children became test subjects in mind control experiments too secret to admit. And the very institutions that claim to shield the vulnerable perfected, instead, the art of hiding them away. Tonight we open the files they tried to bury. We walk through corridors where cries once echoed, never reaching beyond the walls. We revisit scandals that should have ended the system forever, but somehow did not. And we confront the ruins that remain. Silent witnesses to lives lost in the name of order, secrecy, and convenience. Before we begin, welcome to Sleepy History Tales. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? Now is it night, morning, or somewhere in between? Your presence keeps these forgotten histories alive. What follows is not fiction. These are records, testimonies, and ruins that still endure. The story of America's state hospitals is not just about what happened within them, but about how long the world chose to look away. They rose like monuments across the American landscape, vast red brick citadels surrounded by rivers, by farmland, by carefully manicured lawns. To the public eye of the 19th and early 20th centuries, they represented progress, civilization, reaching out to its most fragile members. Reformers and politicians cut ribbons at their grand entrances, promising an age when science, architecture, and compassion would heal minds thought broken beyond repair. Even the architecture spoke of ambition. Wide corridors, high ceilings, windows flooding with light. These were not only aesthetic choices, but physical prayers built on the belief that air and geometry themselves could mend despair. The Kirkbride plan adopted across the country spread long, staggered wings so that patients would wake to sunlight and fresh air, as if healing could be written into stone and glass. In speeches and pamphlets, these institutions were called temples of healing. Newspapers carried photographs of gardens, shaded walks beneath carefully planted trees, porches where patients might gather in quiet recovery. But beneath the optimism lay a foreboding truth. These hospitals were not open sanctuaries. They were controlled spaces. Their grandeur was a disguise. Iron gates barred windows, endless brick upon brick. All a message that those who entered were not meant to return. What the public celebrated as compassion was also a new form of separation. At their openings, governors gave speeches about humane care, while new patients slipped through side doors quietly processed into locked wards. The public saw gardens, not cells, dining halls, not padded rooms. From the very beginning, spectacle disguised reality. The promise of healing carried a contradiction. Asylum spoke of treatment, but their scale suggested containment. By the early 20th century, many of these hospitals grew so vast they resembled cities of their own, with power plants, farms, even cemeteries within their grounds. Brochures praised their self-sufficiency, but in truth it meant they lived apart. Sovereigns sealed away from oversight, answering only to their own administrators. Archival photographs still show us the facades imposing proud, their names carved deep into granite. At the time, they stirred civic pride. But with distance, the images feel different, unsettling. These temples were built as much to contain as to cure, as much to erase from sight as to restore. They began as monuments of hope. Yet the very walls that promised protection became barriers of silence. The optimism of those grand dedication ceremonies did not last. Within a single generation, America's state hospitals were already sinking beneath the weight of their own ambition. What had been promised as sanctuaries of recovery slowly transformed into warehouses of suffering. The collapse was not sudden. It crept in like a shadow. Patient by patient, year by year, budgets thinned, registers swelled, and the staff, always too few, could never match the need. Overcrowding became the first and most bitter betrayal. Institutions designed for a few hundred soon held thousands. Wards built for light and air became suffocating dormitories. Beds lined every corridor so close that attendants could hardly pass between them. And when beds ran out, straw pallets, wooden benches, or bare floors became the only refuge. As early as the 1890s, reports spoke of patients stacked 2, sometimes 3, to a single bed. Officials dismissed them as exaggerations. But inside those walls, the truth was undeniable. Underfunding marked every corner of daily life. Legislatures had celebrated the idea of asylums, but shrank from paying their true cost. Food was stretched too thin, leaving residents hungry. Roofs leaked, plaster crumbled, windows shattered and were patched with cardboard. In winter, heating failed and frost bloomed across the inside of the glass, while patients shivered beneath thin blankets. The therapeutic architecture once designed with such promise became a hollow skeleton of its former self. Staffing too fell far short. Reformers had promised gentle, attentive care. In reality, a handful of exhausted attendants, many untrained, bore the weight of dozens of patients each. Some worked double shifts for wages barely enough to live on. Patients wore thin and restraint, both physical and chemical, became routine. Neglect, unthinkable at the founding, settled in like a permanent guest. Many residents never saw a doctor again after the day of their admission. Illness spread unchecked. Tuberculosis, influenza, and simple, untreated infections claimed lives quietly, the deaths absorbed into the silence of the wards. Reports of abuse did reach the outside world, but they were easy to bury. Committees of visitors noted overcrowding, noted malnutrition, but their findings vanished into annual reports that no one read. Families who asked too many questions were soothed with reassurances. Whistleblowers were branded bitter, unreliable, delusional. And so, the silence deepened. The gulf between promise and reality widened each year. Institutions that had once stood as symbols of progress became little more than holding pens. Their task was no longer healing but containment. The proud symmetry of their design became the stage upon which decay unfolded. Pamphlets continued to show gardens, porches, bright dining halls. But inside, patients sat hunched and silent, rocking back and forth, waiting, forgotten. By the dawn of the 20th century, the pattern was set in stone. What began as a noble experiment in humane care had hardened into a system of neglect. Too little funding, too little scrutiny, and walls both physical and institutional that protected administrators more than patients. Hope was not fulfilled here. Hope was abandoned. From their earliest years, state hospitals learned a terrible truth. Survival depended not on treatment, but on concealment. The same walls that separated patients from society also shielded the institutions from oversight. Silence became policy. Secrecy became their most reliable tool. Letters written by patients rarely reached the outside world intact. Pleas for release descriptions of hunger, of beatings, or despair intercepted tucked away into files marked with words like delusional or unreliable. In many hospitals, no letter could leave without approval. Words that revealed too much were cut away. Entire pages withheld. Families who received these carefully filtered notes believed their loved ones were improving, never knowing that despair had been stripped from the page. And when inspections came, always scheduled, never sudden, the hospitals performed a careful masquerade. Wards scrubbed until they gleamed. Patients dressed in clean clothing for the first time in months. Dining halls staged with fresh meals steaming and plentiful. Meals that would vanish the moment the inspectors walked back through the gates. The most disturbed residents were never shown to visitors. They were hidden away in basement cells or sent outdoors on long forced walks until the inspection ended. What outsiders saw were neat dormitories and docile patients. What they did not see were the shackles, the bare mattresses, the smell of untreated wounds, lingering in wings, left unvisited. Administrators perfected the art of reassurance. Families who questioned conditions were told that discipline was therapeutic, that restraints were necessary, that silence was a sign of recovery. Pamphlets displayed photographs of bright courtyards and breezy porches, while most patients spent their days behind locked doors, staring through barred windows. Annual reports spoke of advancements in care. Yet, in the same pages buried in statistics were deaths by preventable disease, by suicide, by neglect. Even the archives were shaped to obscure. Incident reports, when they existed at all, were filed in ways that dissolved any pattern. Investigations into abuse were handled by the very staff accused, and predictably, those staff declared themselves blameless. Families who pressed too hard were discouraged from visiting, told their presence would hinder recovery. In this way, isolation deepened, not just for the patients but for the truth itself. Whistleblowers were silenced, their warnings dismissed as bitterness. Journalists were denied access until their stories lost momentum. And when on rare occasions an exposé managed to break through, administrators framed it as an aberration, one bad hospital among hundreds supposedly thriving. The public, reassured by official statements, rarely pressed further. Hospitals relied on this willingness not to know this preference for believing that care was quietly being given just out of sight. And so secrecy did not simply hide abuse, it nourished it. What endured behind the facades of red brick and manicured lawns was not progress, but silence. A silence enforced by censored letters, staged inspections, and the quiet burial of records that might have revealed too much. By the mid-20th century, one name had already begun to haunt social workers and investigators alike: Philadelphia's Burberry State Hospital. Patients whispered of hunger, of filth, of violence, but their words rarely escaped the wards. Until in 1948 the silence was broken not by administrators but by a photographer's lens. The exposé that followed appeared in Life magazine, and the images it carried seared themselves into America's conscience. Naked men, emaciated, hollow-eyed, crowded together in barren rooms, where the floors were slick with urine and feces. Others crouched in corners, staring blankly at nothing, their bodies wasting away. Mattresses were scarce, clothing absent, attendants nowhere in sight. The photographs forced an unavoidable comparison. This was not treatment. This was something disturbingly close to what the world had only just witnessed in the liberated concentration camps of Europe. Inspectors themselves wrote of dehumanization of patients existing rather than living. For veterans and survivors of the war, the parallel was inescapable. The outrage was immediate. Editorials declared such inhumanity could not stand in a nation that called itself civilized. Politicians vowed reform. Civic leaders demanded change. But when the noise subsided, the walls of Burberry still stood. Officials promised swift action, but resources were withheld. Administrators shifted blame to budgets, to overcrowding, to the unpredictability of patients. The system itself remained untouched. The scandal, rather than dismantling it, merely illuminated it for a moment before the nation's attention drifted elsewhere. The comparison to Nazi camps was not sensationalism. It was a matter of record. Skeletal figures lie crawling across unwashed bodies, untreated wounds, festering in the dark. Some patients, too weak to stand, crawled on all fours across the filth-covered floors. With so few staff, the stronger patients dominated the weaker building, their own hierarchies of cruelty. Death, when it came, was recorded as little more than a statistic. The photographs existed as evidence, but not as a verdict. Burberry remained open more than 40 years after the exposé, its wards still filled with human shadows. The scandal did not end the system. It only proved how much could be seen and still ignored. For a season, outrage spread through living rooms and legislative halls. But when the season passed, administrators offered explanations rather than solutions. They pointed to overcrowding, to funding shortages, to the supposed nature of the patients themselves. And the walls, red and silent, continued to hold what the public preferred not to know. It was said that the Life magazine photographs showed only some of the darkest corners of Burberry Hospital, that the inside was not so bad. An excuse that sounded strangely familiar. Legislators echoed the same rhetoric, promising funds that were never spent, setting up committees that were quietly let go, assuring the public that improvements were afoot. Yet day after day within those airtight walls, nothing changed. Deny strangely had its own power. Outrage flared, but died quickly. Investigations dragged on then, were buried in reports thick with bureaucracy, remaining recommendations, never requests. Inspectors returned to find a staged scene, patients bathed, neatly dressed orderly. And then, they left convinced, or choosing to ignore it. Inside, the silence returned, as did the hunger and neglect captured in the photographs. It was ironic. Burberry had become a symbol of cruelty, a name that carried national notoriety. Yet, it had survived for another 40 years. During that time, patients continued to sleep on the floor, languishing from untreated illness, living monotonous days interrupted only by occasional bouts of violence. The photographs had exposed the truth. But was exposure enough to bring about change? Or did it require the kind of persistence the system was designed to endure? In archived internal letters, officials of the Pennsylvania Department of Relief always struck a similar tone. They acknowledged the deplorable situation, praised the dedication of staff under harsh conditions, and urged families to be patient. They promised to ease the overcrowding, but the admissions never slowed. They promised to increase staffing, but salaries were so low that no one qualified wanted to stay. Even basic things like sanitation and food rations were indefinitely postponed to save for future capital. For the patients, it was all a continuation. The same corridors, the same smells, the same silence, long after the public had turned away. The promise of reform had been made, and for most, that was enough. But reform never came. It was left to rot behind locked doors. The scandal was supposed to have broken the system, but instead, it was absorbed by the system itself. Byberry did not change, it merely normalized the horror dulled, the horror with bureaucratic endurance. The photographs were somehow turned into evidence of a past that had passed, even as the present was being repeated unscathed. Think about it. Reform requires vigilance and perseverance. Neglect requires only one thing: silence. And in the asylum system, silence is abundant. The photographs should have marked the end. Instead, the initial shock wore off, leaving a different reality. The unacceptable had become a normal part of institutional life in America. Byberry was not alone. He was a mirror image. In Pennhurst, Pennsylvania, in Willowbrook, New York, in countless mental institutions in the Midwest and the South, the situation was not much different. The wards were crowded, patients were tied to beds or left to die in empty living rooms. Food was scarce, clothing was torn, sanitation was poor, and yet administrators talked of progress and therapy. In the annual reports, the paradox was apparent. High patient numbers were cited as evidence of the necessity of the hospital. Yet, at the same time, those same reports showed deaths from preventable disease injuries from being tied, chronic overcrowding. All wrapped up in dry language obscuring the suffering while justifying the institution's existence. When lawmakers are confronted with the evidence, they soothe the public with vague promises of improvement, always deferred to a future budget. And so the cycle continues: exposure and denial, outrage and oblivion. A cycle where cruelty becomes normal, fed by the resilience of the system. And for the patient, normal means forever. The hunger, the filth and the neglect did not disappear after the Byberry scandal. They continued quietly because the system had learned to survive all the scrutiny. Concerned families were reassured that their loved ones were receiving the best possible care in difficult circumstances. The press, once abuzz with horrifying images, moved on to other crises, and the public, having seen enough, chose to look the other way. Ironically, the scandal did not bring down the system, but strengthened it. When the crimes were wrapped up in the story of an exception, other institutions suddenly had a front. As long as their horrors were not exposed in the shocking images of Byberry, they could continue to exist in silence. The lesson is not reform, but the art of concealment. The scandal, instead of destroying the foundation, became a building block. Truth was twisted, and gradually neglect became habit. Cruelty became routine, and horror became institutionalized. In Byberry's shadow, a new gateway opened. In 1908, Pennhurst State School and Hospital was founded a place that promised to be a refuge for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Its founding charter spoke of protection, education, compassion. But within a few decades, Penhurst was associated not with compassion but with cruelty. Behind that gate, children were stripped of dignity, identity, even basic recognition of their humanity. Archives describe camps filled with children, strapped to beds, their limbs bound by leather straps. Not for medical reasons, but for the convenience of exhausted staff who had to manage dozens of them at a time. Some children lay for hours on wet beds, fed only occasionally. Annual reports still cited lack of staffing. But instead of improvement, the solution was more restraint, treating children not as patients, but as burdens to be controlled. Hunger haunted Penhurst. Meals were watery crumbs of stale bread. Malnutrition was recorded in records as a natural consequence of disability, not neglect. Some were declared failure to thrive, a cold phrase that replaced the truth: empty stomachs, emaciated bodies. Photographs later presented as evidence showed gaunt faces, distant eyes, as if life had been drained away bit by bit. Physical abuse was equally common. Testimony in later lawsuits recounted staff beating children when they cried, silencing them with blows and threats. Children who resisted were locked in empty rooms, calling it discipline. Without supervision, brutality becomes routine, passed down from shift to shift. The tragedy of Penhurst is the broken promise. Parents send their children in believing they will get an education, a job, a life of dignity. But instead of a school, Penhurst becomes a warehouse, a place to hide people that society does not want to see. Some children never pick up a book, never learn a word after entering. Their childhood does not end in adulthood, but in confinement. The examination notes that remain today are chilling in their coldness. Patient tied up. Uncooperative patient. Underweight patient. The words repeated for decades, turning the lives of children into numbers problems to be managed rather than people to be nurtured. Penhurst has existed for generations. Abuse and neglect were hidden behind walls and paperwork. The children were promised protection, only to be silenced and raised. They were tied up, beaten, starved, and forgotten, not because of their mistakes, but because society chose to turn its back. It wasn't until 1968 that the wall of silence was broken for the first time, not by administrators or politicians, but by television cameras. CBS aired an investigative report called "Suffer the Little Children." And for the first time, millions of Americans saw what had been hidden behind the doors of the asylum. The report opened with images that could hardly be associated with the word school children sitting silently tied to chairs, emaciated bodies swaying on cold tiles, cries that rang out and then faded away without response. The camera did not zoom. It simply recorded, and the footage said it all. The shock was immediate. The public, long convinced of the promises of improvement, could no longer deny the stark images. Letters poured into the state, and newspapers called Penhurst an indictment of the entire mental institution system. Families who had been skeptical now had proof. Others saw for the first time what should have been a place of humanness was a pit of cruelty. The legal consequences were swift. Suffer the Little Children became evidence in court, cited in lawsuits against the state, arguing that the children's most basic rights had been trampled. The judges could no longer ignore it because now the whole country had seen it. Administrators still made excuses: overcrowding, lack of funding, difficult to care for patients. But those excuses were meaningless when faced with the gaunt faces, the bound arms, the silenced cries. The silence, the system's most durable shield, was shattered by a film crew that dared to record what society did not want to see. Even the title of the report was an accusation: "Suffer the Little Children." Penhurst was not portrayed as a defective institution, but as a place where children suffered as a matter of policy. The question was no longer, was there abuse? But why was it tolerated for so long? Penhurst did not close immediately, but 1968 was the turning point. Before cruelty lived in the shadows, after it lived on film irrevocably. Unfortunately for the forgotten children, the light came too late. But for the rest of the country, it was the first time the wall could no longer hide its secrets. And then, just 4 years later, another place came into the light. In 1972, a reporter walked through the gates of a mental institution again. This time, not with an invitation but with a hidden camera. It was Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, where parents had long whispered about overcrowding, about neglected children, about filth. But until Geraldo Rivera put the footage on the screens at night, it could all be denied. The scenes were hard to forget, children, many of them, naked, huddled on the cold ground. Filthy hallways where they paced back and forth, lost their eyes, vacant. Insufficient beds, non-existent sanitation. Some lay in their own waste, their bodies emaciated, while indifferent staff walked through rooms as cramped as anthills. Rivera called Willowbrook a snake pit, and never has a word been more accurate. The facility was built for 4,000 people, but by the early 1970s, it housed more than 6,000. Overcrowding was the excuse. In fact, neglect was the root cause. For years, the administration justified its lack of resources made the situation inevitable. But was that really the reason? The light from the television news that year pierced every defense. No statistic could obscure the sight of children huddled on the dirt floor, their young faces drowning in hunger and oblivion. The image pierced through decades of rhetoric to reveal the truth. This was not the exception, but the very nature of closed foster care. The public exploded in outrage. Families who had placed their children in Willowbrook demanded answers. Advocacy groups seized on the footage as living proof, suing not just Willowbrook, but the legality of keeping disabled people in the system. Newspapers reprinted every frame, editorials called for reform, and officials rushed to calm public opinion. But Willowbrook did not collapse immediately. School administrators apologized. Politicians promised investigations, additional funding. The excuse of understaffing was again used, as it had been at Penhurst, as it had been at countless other places. But the images were captured, and once they were on television, they could not be buried. Rivera's documentary was shown again and again, becoming irrefutable evidence. In 1975, an ordinance forced Willowbrook to improve conditions. By the 1980s, the doors were gradually closed, and in 1987 the last resident left. By then, the name Willowbrook had become a symbol of horror in the collective memory. If Penhurst had been explained as a budget failure, Willowbrook was undeniable. The lens's gaze was too precise, too cold, and too many people had seen it. Denial was no longer an option. The camera had thrown open the door, and the world could not forget what it had revealed. But the Cold War added a new layer of horror. The obsession didn't stop at the border. It seeped into labs, universities, and even infiltrated psychiatric hospitals. One of the most chilling stains was MK Ultra, a secret CIA program that experimented with mind control and turned patients into test subjects. Creedmoor State Hospital in New York was one of the confirmed locations. Declassified documents show that children, young adults, and psychiatric patients were used as guinea pigs. They were given LSD repeatedly, often without warning. They were locked in isolation chambers for days, cut off from light and sound, so that their senses would slowly crumble. Some were hypnotized, led into a semi-conscious state to do things they didn't want to do. It was all covered up under the guise of national security. It was feared that the enemy was also studying psychological control, and so America took it upon itself to do the same. Only, the price was not the volunteers, but the most vulnerable people locked up in places that were supposed to protect them. In the remaining records, one finds only cold language, behavioral changes, subject reactions, inability to adapt. But the voices of the patients themselves are absent. They are children who have been stunned into unconsciousness. They are adults who have awoken from long days of hallucinations, their minds more shattered than when they entered. For years, the cover-up was almost perfect. Drugs were recorded as treatments. Dark cells were called therapy. Hypnosis became routine testing. Those who signed off believed they were serving the national interest. Only when the MK Ultra files were declassified did the truth come out. Those hospitals were not just places of neglect, but secret laboratories where the weakest became sacrifices. And Creedmoor was not alone. A series of other facilities were also turned into silent stages for horrifying experiments. All were justified in the cold language of the Cold War. But behind only the identities that were forever broken. Just ask yourself, how many other stories were never written in the files? How many screams forever considered symptoms of illness? In those years, the line between care and control became frighteningly fragile. And once science has taken on the mask of secrecy, cruelty can be called progress. It was the stripping of memory of self and of will. In the locked rooms, the basic moral foundation of science consent was lost, not through oblivion, but through its very elimination. The subjects were chosen as the ones who could not resist, whose rights were taken away. The moment the prison doors closed behind them, administrators signed on, believing they were serving the nation. Doctors justified themselves as contributing to human knowledge. But the patients, they were never asked. There were experiments designed to deliberately break the mind. High doses of LSD were administered over and over again, combined with hours of recorded reminders to erase old memories and replace them with new ones. Children were locked in isolation chambers without light, without sound. Their development was distorted by the forced void. It all hinges on a chilling assumption. These lives can be broken, separated, observed, and then discarded, without consequence. The archives have a cold, alien tone. The dry reports note increased compliance, significant regression, but never name the people behind them. What emerges is a portrait of a science stripped of its humanity, where the pain of patients is only valuable if it illuminates the data. These people were not chosen because they had something special to reveal. They were chosen because they could not resist. The system that was built to silence now conceals exploitation. The CIA needed subjects who would never be remembered, and state hospitals were ready to provide. Decades later, a handful of survivors recounted fragmented memories, weeks lost in a chemical fog, names, forgotten voices in their heads that no longer seemed their own. But for every testimony, dozens, hundreds of screams faded into silence, buried in sealed files. This was no accident. This was the design. Fragility was not a flaw but the foundation of the entire program. The most defenseless became the most exploited. For years, the survivors' accounts seemed too good to be true. Who could have imagined repeated injections that shattered their minds? Who could have believed the long, disorienting days in the dark? The haunting whispers that recurred as they were hypnotized. The memories were so foreign, so implanted, that their stories were dismissed as the hallucinations of mental patients. But then, the documents came out. In the mid-1970s, a series of congressional investigations dug up the buried pieces. The name MKUltra emerged. Among the declassified documents were memos and research reports which confirmed clearly the experiments had taken place. They were authorized, they were funded, and the subjects were patients in psychiatric hospitals. The language in the files was mundane behavioral modification experiments, prolonged sensory deprivation studies, LSD schedules. But behind the dry language lay blood tears and broken minds. The pages documented the injection of hallucinogenic drugs into children, the systematic hypnosis, the erasure of memories through repeated trauma. Each document bore the signature of the official who had approved or covered up, all in the name of national security. Now survivors who had been dismissed as delusional were suddenly vindicated, not because the government apologized, but because the paperwork was undeniable. Yet, even as the truth was revealed, darkness remained. Many of the documents were destroyed in 1973 on the orders of CIA leadership, forever obliterating the true scope of the program. Only fragments remained enough to prove, but not enough to tell. For those who suffered, the revelation was both vindication and despair. Yes, their memories were confirmed. But it came too late to bring justice. The facilities where the experiments took place were either closed or denied altogether. The architects of the program quietly retired their careers untarnished. The remaining terror lay in the banality of language. The horrors were not hidden in code, but recorded in plain administrative documents. As if injecting LSD into a child were as normal as prescribing aspirin, the files had turned suffering into procedure, people into data. And when they were finally released, they were both unearthed truth and tombstones for crushed souls. The silence that had protected the program was shattered. But accountability never came. What remained were the cold records and the lives that were never healed. For more than a century, the asylum walls held absolute power. Entry meant silence, and incarceration was a foregone conclusion. Families, doctors, administrators, they held power while patients lived and died in despair. But in the mid-20th century, after decades of exposure and outrage, the law finally stepped in. And in 1975, the United States Supreme Court delivered a landmark decision, O'Connor versus Donaldson. The case centered on a man named Kenneth Donaldson. He had been incarcerated in a Florida mental hospital for nearly 15 years, without any meaningful treatment. His only crime was his delusions. He was not violent, he was not a danger to others. and yet he was forced to live behind bars simply because he was labeled mentally ill. The Supreme Court's decision was historic. It declared, "The state has no constitutional right to detain a person indefinitely without treatment, especially if the person is not a danger to himself or others." That ruling overturned centuries of old practice, affirming that detention without treatment is illegal. For the first time, the nation's highest court acknowledged patients are not just objects of confinement. They are still citizens. They have rights. The doors of the asylum did not swing open, but a new legal framework had been established. Administrators could no longer invoke vague illness to justify indefinite detention. Judges and lawyers were now entering conversations that had previously been reserved for medical boards. A system once protected by silence was now confronted with constitutionality. Almost simultaneously, another lawsuit from Penhurst added to the momentum for reform. In 1974, a group of patients sued the state of Pennsylvania, claiming that their treatment violated the Constitution. Testimonies of abuse, neglect, and humiliation, once considered exaggerated, now rang out in federal court. The trial dragged on for years, but the outcome set a precedent. Treatment facilities were responsible for providing humane living conditions and basic education, not just confinement. When the court declared Penhurst unconstitutional, it did more than condemn a place. It shook the legitimacy of a model built on neglect. Together, these decisions marked a fracture in the asylum's absolute power. But the victory came late and cold. It came after generations had lived and died behind iron gates. The law, after all, only arrived when the buildings themselves had begun to rot from within. And yet, the precedents were landmark. They affirmed a principle: mental illness does not abolish civil rights, and confinement without treatment is no longer tolerated by the law. What was once self-evident is now unconstitutional. The asylum walls still stand, but they are no longer impregnable. The court has spoken. Silence alone can no longer justify confinement. In that recognition, however belated, patients win the first shreds of freedom. When the last patients were released, when the doors were locked for the last time, the asylum system did not disappear. The walls still stood haunting the forgotten landscape. Their size and silence were a silent testimony to the terrible scale of what had once been hidden within. Across America, red brick corridors stood empty windows, shadowed by wind and rain floors, covered in thick dust. Buildings that had once stood as monuments to hope now stood as ruins. Monuments to the system's failures. The movement to defund mental hospitals, which began in the 1960s and was fueled by court rulings and public scandals, has shuttered dozens of facilities. But closure does not mean obliteration. Structures too large and too costly to demolish are left to rot with time. Rusted locked doors succumb to the elements, and darkness gives way to curious onlookers, vandals, photographers, the mysterious, to enter the places where invisible lives once held. Inside, the remnants remain. Rusted stretchers lean against peeling walls. Mattresses have collapsed into piles, their cotton fillings scattered by rats. Murals once painted to comfort have peeled away into abstract fragments. In the basement and attic files are strewn pages damp ink smeared. The names of forgotten people are now black mold. Each room is a memory. Each object is a relic. And the silence inside was not empty. Those who entered often spoke of a strange weight, an echo that lingered long after the footsteps had faded. hallways once built for observation, now stretched endlessly in their abandonment. Once filled wards were now dusty, and the wind whistled through broken glass. The architecture itself speaks a testimony in stone and steel that this was a system too vast to vanish, too haunted to endure. Urban explorers walk its empty corridors, their cameras capturing what remains, hallways lined with rusting wheelchairs, medical charts left forgotten in filing cabinets, wards where paint drifts down like autumn leaves. Their photographs circulate online, but the true weight lies not in the images themselves, but in what they reveal. The ruins speak again, not with the voices of patients silenced long ago, but with the residue of their absence. To step through these halls is to confront history preserved in decay. Outside the grounds echo the same story lawns once cut with precision, now choked with vines trees pressing through broken foundations, reclaiming the land. In overgrown cemeteries, graves marked only by numbers lie hidden in the grass. Their anonymity is the final reminder of how completely the institutions erased individual lives. For some, the ruins invite curiosity, even spectacle. But for others, they stand as warnings. They reveal not only the decay of brick and mortar, but the collapse of a system sustained by neglect, secrecy, and silence. Every broken window, every collapsing roof, every abandoned ward is evidence. The past is not buried. It still stands, waiting to be read. The hospitals were once called temples of healing. Today their ruins tell another truth, that what began in hope ended in silence. And that silence lingers still in every crumbling wall. They are not merely abandoned buildings. They are monuments of warning, their emptiness louder than the voices once trapped inside. The record of America's state hospitals is not only about what happened within their walls, but about how long those walls were allowed to stand unchallenged. Neglect persisted not because it was invisible, but because society chose to look away. The horror was not only in the restraints, the hunger, the experiments. It was in the silence that surrounded them. The silence of administrators, of legislators, of the public itself. From Byberry to Penhurst, from Willowbrook to Creedmoor, the cycle repeated. Scandal, outrage, promises, and then silence. Each generation pretended to be shocked, as though the revelations were new, when in truth they confirmed what had been known for decades. Reports gathered dust. Families pleaded. Investigations produced recommendations instead of reforms. The ruins that remain today embody this history. Crumbling walls, broken windows, overgrown cemeteries, they are not just relics of a failed medical system. They are monuments to forgetting. Each abandoned corridor is evidence of how long suffering can persist when hidden behind institutional doors. The silence of these ruins is heavy because it mirrors the silence that once protected them. And the cost of that silence was measured in human lives. Children who should have known classrooms instead lived bound to beds. Adults who sought help found themselves confined without treatment. Vulnerable patients already isolated became unwilling subjects in experiments that erased memory, identity, and self. These lives were not lost to accident, but to a structure built on concealment, excused by a society that preferred not to see. To forget is to risk repetition. History has shown that secrecy and neglect thrive where oversight is absent, where suffering can be dismissed as inevitable, where institutions exist to contain rather than to care. The names of Byberry, Penhurst, and Willowbrook carry weight today only because they were exposed. Countless other hospitals remain unnamed, their stories buried with patients who never left. The lesson of the state hospitals is not confined to their era. It is a warning. Systems built on silence will always breed cruelty, and justice delayed will always become justice denied. The horror is not only that children suffered, but that they suffered for so long before anyone listened. The institutions collapsed, but the conditions that allowed them to thrive, secrecy, indifference, the willingness to forget, remain dangers even now. Still, the ruins stand as stark reminders. They do not speak, but they do not need to. Their silence is a testimony louder than words. The cost of forgetting is written in every broken brick, every nameless grave, every life erased. The hospitals may be gone, but their warning endures. What is ignored will always return, and silence will always exact its price.